Welcome to Accented Dialogues in Diaspora. I'm Viet Thanh Nguyen, your host, and today we have the honor of speaking with Evyn Lê Espiritu Gandhi and Cathy Linh on the topic of Vietnam and Palestine. Accented is a production of the Diasporic Vietnamese Artist Network, or DVAN, and DVAN's mission is to amplify diasporic Vietnamese and Southeast Asian literary voices. We empower artists in the diaspora and champion our complex and diverse stories, ensuring our perspectives reshape and expand the broader cultural narrative. I am so delighted to have the chance to speak to our two guests tonight on the topic of Vietnam and Palestine. Evyn Lê Espiritu Gandhi is an associate professor of Asian American Studies at UCLA, Tovaangar, and the author of Archipelago of Resettlement, Vietnamese Refugee Settlers and Decolonization Across Guam and Israel-Palestine, published by the University of California Press, and awarded the 2025 ACLS Open Access Book Prize in History. Welcome, Evyn Lê Espiritu Gandhi. Good to see you tonight. And my other guest is the Cathy Linh. She is a writer and multidisciplinary artist. She is the author of Becoming Ghost, a poetry collection that was a finalist for the National Book Award, and the co-author of an Asian American A to Z, a children's guide to our history from Haymarket Books. Her film, We Were the Scenery, was shortlisted for an Academy Award in the short documentary category and won the Short Film Jury Award in Nonfiction at the Sundance Film Festival. Welcome, Cathy. Well, it is officially the Lunar New Year. It just happened here. So chúc mừng năm mới to both of you and to our audience. Happy Lunar New Year. It's the year of the fire horse. Cathy, what's the New Year been like for you? What has it brought?
It's very new, so I don't have anything to report back exactly, but I do know that it is supposed to be a year of defined by intensity and momentum. So I'm excited to see what happens to everyone around us as we are in this together.
Evyn, what kind of energy are you bringing into the year of the fire horse?
Well, I'm really inspired about how other people are interpreting this year. So I was scrolling Instagram last night and saw, this is the year of the fire horse. Fire melts ice. And this is the year of the fire horse and decked out in Palestinian colors, which is really relevant to our conversation today. So really excited to see what that momentum brings, as Cathy was mentioning. And on a personal note, I'm a horse. So interested in just kind of recentering and regrounding and seeing what this year brings.
That's awesome. Yes, free Palestine, abolish ICE. Those are two of the slogans I like. Well, I use something more obscene. I'm not sure I can actually say that online. Okay. I get into a lot of trouble with Vietnamese audiences when they understand what kind of curse words I'm using in Vietnamese to describe abolish ICE. We can get to that as well. But we're on the topic of Vietnam and Palestine, and coincidentally, the Lunar New Year, or Tet for the Vietnamese people, was on February 17th, which for many Muslims was also the beginning of Ramadan as well. So I would take that as a positive omen for our discussion tonight. But the topic of Vietnam and Palestine is close and dear to many of us who are Vietnamese writers, scholars, activists who have looked to the complicated history of decolonization, revolution, nationalism in Southeast Asia, and have sought to locate it in the larger context of what was happening in the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s, all the way up until the present. I'm wondering, Evyn, if you can give us a little bit of a summation about how Vietnam and Palestine are related.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to do so. First, thanks for bringing up the Ramadan connection. Tuesday was also Fat Tuesday, so right before the Lenten season for Catholics. And I know there's a lot of Catholics in our Vietnamese diaspora. So thinking about all these resonances between the spiritual, between this new year, between the religious. And as you said, these connections and reverberations go way back. So I think the story really begins in 1954 with General Vo Nguyen Yap's, decisive victory over the French for the Vietnamese anti-colonial struggle, revolutionary struggle. And this really inspired third world revolutions around the world, including, those in Palestine with Yasser Arafat and this Palestinian liberation movement. And people told me that Palestinian soldiers would take on the nickname Zap, in inspiration for this Vietnamese military leader and what he could do. And this kind of exchange back and forth actually culminated in Palestinian Liberation Organization guerrilla fighters going to Vietnam a couple times in the late 60s and 70s to actually learn military tactics, guerrilla tactics. So they were really inspired by how Vietnamese revolutionary fighters were not only rhetorically standing up to, the French colonists and then U.S. imperialists, but really fighting the battle, right, and winning that battle, in the lands of Vietnam. So they really wanted to learn on a strategic level, what's happening in Vietnam and how can we apply that to our struggle in Palestine. And once Vietnam becomes a state, North Vietnam actually, or even prior to this, North Vietnam actually establishes diplomatic relations with the PLO. Yasser Arafat visits in the late 1960s. And just want to share a couple quotes from Yasser Arafat and Ho Chi Minh that kind of really, I think, encapsulate this revolutionary solidarity that was culminating in this moment. So in 1969, Yasser Arafat says, the freedom of peoples, so he says that Palestinians are fighting, not only for themselves, but for, quote, the freedom of peoples who are fighting for their liberty and existence, the freedom of the people of Vietnam who are suffering like the people of Palestine, and the freedom of all humanity from oppression, discrimination, and exploitation. And then somewhat in response, or actually earlier that year, in January of 1969, Ho Chi Minh will say that Vietnamese people, quote, vehemently condemn the Israeli aggressors, and they, quote, fully support the Palestinian people's liberation movement and the struggle of the Arab people for the liberation of territories occupied by Israeli forces. So you see, these great leaders of these revolutionary struggles really talking to one another and drawing linkages in their shared struggle against global imperialism.
It's been a long time since the Vietnamese Revolution. That was going on since at least the 1920s, and not climaxing, but reaching a really visible point in 1954 with the Vietnamese victory over the French at Dien Bien Phu, as you mentioned. And that was 72 years ago. And so perhaps for newer generations born after 9/11, for example, the memory of a Vietnamese revolution and how it was really a globally inspiring revolution may have faded or become a part of the history. But it was really, really, really powerful. Che Guevara called for 1,000 Vietnams to blossom around the world in the 1960s. And I was recently in El Salvador, and I was speaking to a couple of the former revolutionaries there who were fighting against the Salvadoran military in the 1970s and the 1980s, the military that was being sponsored by the United States as it was conducting these horrifying atrocities against Salvadoran peasants and the Salvadoran revolutionaries. And the ones that I was speaking to had actually been to Hanoi. They had actually gone there, as you were. So it wasn't just Palestinians, but there were people from all over the world going to North Vietnam seeking inspiration. This is probably a good time to also quote another Palestinian, the legendary Rassan Kanafani, very, very important figure in Palestinian revolution, Palestinian letters. He was a novelist, a journalist, an editor, a Marxist. Very, very, so important was he in the Palestinian revolutionary efforts that Israel assassinated him and his niece in a car bombing when he was only in his 30s. But in his selected political writings, there's an essay on the underlying synthesis of the revolution. This is 1971, and it is actually all about looking towards the Vietnamese revolution as a model for what he thought, Rassan Kanafani thought, the Palestinians should be doing. And so he says, recognizing the depth of the Vietnamese revolution, its vanguardism and success means objectively acknowledging and absorbing the lessons by which this revolution deepened, became rooted, and proved its worth. This study, the one that he is writing, forms a thesis inseparable from the theses that Arab fighters must study, absorb, and use to their benefit in their struggle to conquer their Zionist, imperialist, and reactionary enemies. And Rassan Kanafani was also, I didn't really know this until recently, a graphic designer. He came up with a poster that features Vietnam and Palestine, which has become really legendary for anybody who types in these keywords, but Vietnamese-Palestinian solidarity. which we will see right now. But it is a really inspiring poster, and it summarizes sort of the imagery of this time period of the 60s and 1970s, and what it is that the Vietnamese Revolution, the Northern Vietnamese Revolution, the revolution of the National Liberation Front of the South, what they represented to decolonizing efforts and revolutionaries all over the world. And in this poster, you can see a North Vietnamese soldier passing off a flag called Victory, handing it off to a Palestinian fighter wielding an automatic rifle over the sign Vietnamese Palestine. So that memory still has stayed with so many people, which is why we're talking about it tonight, looking at the way these two revolutions have been intertwined, and looking at some of the complications as well. Cathy, you are a poet, an artist, an activist, an organizer, an administrator, as we'll get to, and then you're also now a filmmaker with this film We Were the Scenery. And I have to say I'm an executive producer. I'm very proud to be an executive producer on this very powerful short documentary, which I'll describe a little bit so the audience knows what it's about, because I think it is relevant to our discussion about Vietnam, Palestine, and eventually the diasporas that these nations have produced. But Cathy, your parents were Vietnamese refugees fleeing from communism. I think that's fair to say. They ended up in the Philippines in the late 1970s and wound up becoming extras in the making of Apocalypse Now, this legendary American movie about the Vietnam War. And this experience of your parents is the subject of your National Book Award finalist collection of poetry, Becoming Ghost, which is an amazing book. You should all read it. And then also this documentary, We Were the Scenery. So Cathy, how did you become involved with what Edward Said has called the question of Palestine?
I'm thinking about this question. How did I become involved? I feel that I don't have an origin story, but I mean, I have an origin story in that my parents are Vietnamese refugees. And so anytime, one sees or hears what is happening in Palestine, there's a visceral reaction. There's a visceral reaction similar, I think, to how many activists in the 1960s and 70s during the Asian American movement felt about watching the Vietnam War unfold. It's something very visceral to see people who look like you or who feel like they're in a circumstance that resonates with your people, that you feel like the injustice, the oppression, you feel like you must do something about it. So that's one answer. And another answer is just friendships. And I think that's actually really a big part of solidarity. So just just making friends and being connected with a number of Palestinians who living in the US, right? So I think that that is a primary way that I feel connected to Palestine. And I feel that, so like my poetry book, I'd been working on it for 10 years, and the last poems I wrote were to address the current and ongoing genocide occurring in Palestine, because it just drew up questions or similarities to me about, as you watch Americans who are trying to do something to stop it on this side, and feeling it, that feeling for me, my parents, my family members were dying in Vietnam, and American activists were trying to stop this war. And now I'm on this other side, being an American who feels deeply responsible. And so I think that's a big part of it. I mean, I don't know, for me, how can Vietnamese people not feel responsibility toward another people being oppressed in a similar way? That's something that's on my mind.
Part of it, I think, is also, in addition to what you're saying, is sometimes it's looking at what's taking place and realizing that the United States is supporting what Israel is doing. And of course, many of us are aware, of course, that we're paying for bombs and missiles and sending these types of armaments. But even visually, it's shocking sometimes. Like I was in El Salvador again, and in looking at images from El Salvador in the 1980s, you could swear that you could transpose some of these images directly to Vietnam, because the U.S. military equipped the Salvadoran army with the same uniforms, same helmets, same weapons, same armored personnel carriers, same Huey helicopters that were being used in Vietnam, both by American troops and by South Vietnamese troops. And then you look at the Israeli army in Lebanon in the early 1980s, for example, they're using the same American military weaponry as well, and that extends all the way into the present. So there is that sense that the history and the structures of colonialism and occupation and so on that brought the United States to Vietnam has also connected Vietnam, Israel, Palestine, El Salvador, all these kinds of places where American empire has extended itself. Now, one of the consequences of American empire and the American presence in Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia has been the creation of diasporas all over the world. For the Vietnamese diaspora specifically, I think the figures right now are somewhere around 4 million Vietnamese people scattered around the world in dozens of different countries, with the United States being the largest, the site of the largest Vietnamese diaspora population. But one of the things I learned from your work, Evyn, was the existence of a Vietnamese diaspora in Israel. That really blew my mind. So tell us about that first, and then maybe that will segue into how it is that you were drawn to this question of Palestine.
Yeah, so I first learned about the Vietnamese refugee diaspora in Israel, who eventually became Israeli citizens. So they are Vietnamese Israelis. In fall 2013, I had recently started graduate school at UC Berkeley, where I know you went as well. Viet was very formative for you as well. And, I was taking this class on comparative diaspora. So we were looking at Black Atlantic diaspora, questions of Jewish diaspora and Jewish diaspora critiques of Zionism as well. And I came into graduate school interested in Vietnamese refugee diaspora, and I was like, what am I going to write, for this paper that I have to write? And kind of through my research, trying to connect theories of Jewish diaspora and Vietnamese diaspora, learned about this Vietnamese Israeli population. So just to kind of give an overview, from 1977 to 1979, the state of Israel accepted little less than 400 Vietnamese refugees. Some of them were Vietnamese refugees that they had picked up on ship in international waters. Some of them they had hand-selected from refugee camps across Southeast Asia. And really in the rhetoric, Prime Minister Menachem Begin identified Israel as this nation of Holocaust refugees who was uniquely positioned to empathize with the next kind of global refugee crisis, which was the Southeast Asian refugee crisis, and his kind of articulation. And so he said, we're going to welcome these Vietnamese refugees and offer them refuge in this land of refuge. Of course, what this narrative, obscures and actively erases is the ongoing displacement, right, by the state of Israel of Palestinian refugees and Palestinian exiles from their homeland. So I was really interested in unpacking, how can this refugee empathy be deployed towards one population, but so brutally withheld, right, from another population at the same time. And, I think Vietnamese Israelis, many of whom still live there now, are caught in this complicated relationship, right, where they feel, sincere gratitude to the state of Israel. At the same time, they feel a sense of insecurity, right, in this space of conflict, and don't quite know always where to place their loyalties in regards to all the securitarian rhetoric that's being deployed. And I think, for my research and my interest then in kind of Palestinian activism, so I guess to kind of back up. So while I was, right after kind of writing this paper was the summer of 2014, right? And we have the Gaza airstrikes, or the Israeli airstrikes in Gaza. And this was another kind of like global flashpoint in which the, kind of slow violence of Palestinian dispossession kind of made its way into global public eye on such a vibrant level. And this led to a lot of, kind of Palestinian organizing and Palestinian solidarity organizing at UC Berkeley. And so I was also really inspired by a call of a lot of Palestinian activists and scholars who are saying, we've been also doing this work for decades. And so if you want to come and be in solidarity with us, they encouraged us to really articulate what's our kind of situated positionality, right, to this struggle. And I said, okay, well, one way I can do this as a writer, as a scholar, as an academic is to actually research some of these Vietnam-Palestine connections. So I'll say I started, as this very hopeful grad student who was like, I want to find instances of solidarity between Vietnamese Israelis and the Palestinian liberation struggle. And there's not a lot of expressions, right? There's a lot of structural antagonisms that kind of seemingly pit interests against one another. But this led me to this research of kind of this prehistory between, solidarity between the Vietnamese revolutionary struggle, which was, socialist-led, communist-led, and the PLO that I had mentioned earlier.
Palestinians talk a lot about the Palestinian exception. That is, that in the West, from Israel, we'll count Israel as part of the West because, Israelis themselves see themselves as part of the West. That was part of the founding vision of Israel from Theodor Herzl, is to think of Israel as a what do you call it, a rampart of Europe against Asia. This is a very specific language that he was using. So if we think about that there is a Palestinian exception to the Western standards of democracy, rights, equality, justice, all of these wonderful ideas, once we start probing that, then what happens is that the question of identity is not really sufficient. Identity, for example, for Vietnamese refugees in the United States, for example, allows them to become Americans and to participate in all these wonderful opportunities that are supposedly part of Western liberal democracy. But the exception unravels all of that and proves identity to be a very limited concept. As you're saying, the Vietnamese in Israel, as part of this diaspora, find their identity very confused because who are they supposed to be siding with, and what kind of complications are they finding themselves in? And likewise for Vietnamese refugees, and your work points to this, Evyn, and I think yours does too, Cathy. What does becoming a Vietnamese American actually mean? This is, I think this is a lesson that we who are doing work in the Vietnamese diasporic context have learned from looking at Palestinians, but also looking at indigenous peoples within the North America, for example, pointing out that to use your identity to become a part of a settler colonial state is deeply problematic because it's based upon the exception. Like, there are rights for everybody except indigenous peoples. There are rights for everybody except Palestinians. And I know that in your book, Evyn, the Archipelago of Resettlement, it's not just Israel, Palestine, but you bring in Guam as well. And I think in your work, you're making these types of connections. It's no longer just about being a Vietnamese person or being a Vietnamese American. There's something else you're probing in terms of the refugee experience, in terms of colonization, in terms of dispersal, that allows you to link seemingly disparate peoples together, from Palestinians to Vietnamese people to the Chamorro of Guam. So I'm wondering if you can explain all of that to our audience.
Yeah, thanks for kind of laying that out. Yeah, I think that maybe there needs to be a shift away from identity and something more like community or diaspora. I mean, I think in my work, I'm really critical of how nation state building and nationalism operates. And this gets really complicated, right? Because nationalism, of course, is a big root of anti-colonial struggles, right? That's the inspiration to create, right, one's own independent nation. But what happens once one gets their own independent nation, right? We can see this in Vietnam too. There's a lot of betrayal of their revolutionary ideals. Vietnam is also critiqued as a settler colonial state, right? And its treatment of ethnic minorities and indigenous minorities in Vietnam. And in recent years, Vietnam has also, for economic reasons, have diplomatic relations with the state of Israel. And so trying to think about, and in this kind of move to think about diaspora or community, I'm really inspired by folks, for example, the Palestine Feminist Collective. And as one of my colleagues, Lubna Kutami, recently, put it, as a co-founder of the Palestine Feminist Collective, she said a lot of the work that they're trying to do is to supplement the anti-colonial with the decolonial. And I think that's really relevant to my work as well, which is to say, not only does the horizon of our struggle going to be, a defeat of colonialism and a creation of a new nation state with its own, issues and discriminations and borders, et cetera. But the work of the decolonial is to actually question, right, the structures of settler colonialism, global capitalism, racial capitalism, kind of like racializing of the border and who's included in citizenship rights. So the decolonial really questions that, right? And I think that's a lot of the work, as this unfinished revolutionary project of Palestine can really reflect back to, the Vietnamese diaspora across Guam and Israel, Palestine, and here in the United States. What if, this decolonial work of, yes, we have citizenship rights. A lot of our communities have citizenship rights, even though, we can see with deportations that is always kind of put into question. But how can we unsettle, right, that citizenship and rather think through more decolonial possibilities?
Cathy, what are for you some of the similarities and differences between the Vietnamese and Palestinian diasporic experiences?
I was just thinking about the ways that when I think it's not the diasporic experiences that I'm thinking about just the ways that the Vietnam War, as well as the current genocide, has given rise to a number of movements and political organizing that feels similar. Um, what also feels very similar is the repression of activism, right? So when you're thinking about what happened at Kent State, um, that also looks like what happened at the encampments at UCLA, Columbia, across the country. There is a deployment of the National Guard, or there's just so much state power that is utilized to repress student movements. And, in terms of the divergences, speaking toward the Palestinian exception, I mean, the US was ostensibly on the side of South Vietnam, right? The losing side, according to my family, and the US is genuinely, Israel wouldn't exist without Great Britain, the US, Germany, all of these Western powers giving them cover. So I think that there is a difference between my family's experiences and Palestinians in the US because my family, as refugees, as Vietnamese refugees, are given refugee status in the US as a kind of cover, right? There's a kind of sense of apology. We lost. So there is a sense that you are suddenly less killable because, we can't take your land anymore. So, and well, we can't take the land anymore. So we need to provide some kind of narrative of salvation for the people who are now being sort of taken over by communism, right? So there's a narrative through line um, that that is convenient for the US, whereas like for Palestinians, people are losing their green cards, right? They are currently being unfairly um, try, the US is trying to deport people who are here legally, for instance. So there's a kind of sense of the US providing cover and rights to Vietnamese refugees, but not doing that for Palestinian refugees.
Palestinian people are diverse. There's different political viewpoints, there's internal conflicts, and on and on and on. But there's at least a general sense, at least in the Palestinian diaspora, I think that resistance to Israel and supporting the people of West Bank and Gaza and engaging in this project for Palestinian liberation. I think there's a general consensus about that. But for the Vietnamese diaspora, very different situation. And I think, Cathy, you were getting at this, which is that the Palestinian diaspora exists for very different reasons than the Vietnamese diaspora exists. Now, there are dozens of countries where the Vietnamese diaspora exists, and each nation has its own particular character, as Evyn has already pointed out with in the case of Israel. But in the case of the United States, where we're located, the Vietnamese diaspora for the most part, exists because of anti-communism, because of people fleeing what they perceive to be a authoritarian communist regime that they disagree with, and that has shaped the politics of the Vietnamese diaspora in really important ways. Has tended to make it fairly conservative, especially for the older generation, but even for some of the younger generation as well. And that conservatism is reflected in terms of a deep support for Donald Trump and for MAGA and the far right and so on, a deep support for things like deportations and the current sort of politics of using ICE as a secret police to target people. And I'm sure that it also affects, Vietnamese diasporic attitudes towards everything that we've been talking about in terms of in terms of Palestine, in terms of Israel. I think there's a considerable support for Israel in the Vietnamese American diaspora. And please correct me if you've heard differently, but that goes along with a general support for the uses of American power globally. And what we've been talking about, the kind of keywords we've been using in terms of resistance against imperialism and colonization, and the idea of the United States as an occupying country, a lot of Vietnamese Americans would totally disagree with how we've been discussing this issue. So how do you, as Vietnamese American activists, artists, scholars, engage with this I think really fundamental contradiction between what you think, what your work is about, and what some of the general currents of the Vietnamese American and diasporic community happen to be in regards to Israel and Palestine? Evyn, what do you think?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think that this is a really important question, right? So when we think about Vietnam-Palestine solidarity, like what is that Vietnam, right? That's being invoked. It's not the South Vietnamese struggle, which allied with the U.S. It's not the kind of democratic republicanist vision of a post-colonial Vietnam. It's a communist, socialist, revolutionary vision of Vietnam that was aligning with Palestine in the 60s and 70s. So I guess I'll say that I've been really inspired, as Cathy said, by the students and the student activists here at UCLA, where I teach, but also, across the country and also around the world, frankly. And when I wrote this book, Archipelago of Resettlement came out in 2022, which was before October 7th. So I never would have, well, I guess we could see the writing on the wall that a genocide might have been coming, but I didn't foresee, that October 7th would unfold. And so I've been really inspired by how, I guess, Vietnamese Americans have reached out to me, or also, come to the book and the research and the Vietnam-Palestine solidarity, kind of historical connections, and drawn inspiration from that. At the same time that I think that they realize that these inherited legacies are complicated, right? As I said, how can they hold and honor the refugee journeys of their parents and grandparents and the very real hardships that they faced under communist rule and re-education camps? How can you honor that at the same time that you also kind of see what's unfolding in Palestine today, right? And since 1948 and even prior to 1948, right? With kind of genocide and mass displacement and exile. And so this kind of both and approach and understanding the kind of like multiple invocations of what Vietnam can mean, I think is something that I encourage, students in the next generation to hold on to, right? That yes, it is complicated. But I think that there is a way, to say, and like you were kind of mentioning, Viet, I think it's really holding on to that kind of refugee subjectivity, and in a less, like a less colonial vision than Menachem Begin, who I quoted earlier. How can we kind of activate this refugee empathy, right? Which might cut across these seemingly political divisions between conservatism and kind of leftist activism, et cetera, to rather say, at the level of lived experiences or familial experience of displacement, is there a kind of empathy and even solidarity that can be resonate there and can be generated there?
I mean, the key word is refugees, and the idea of having a refugee identity or refugee politics is actually very unpredictable. It does not to be a refugee doesn't necessarily make you progressive. In fact, it can actually make you really reactionary, and we see that in the Vietnamese refugee community, but in many refugee communities. So the kind of politics we're talking about are not unique to the Vietnamese refugee community. You can be a refugee and seek to use that identity in order to further your claim to assimilation and to citizenship in the new nation, and to participate in all of the problematic politics of the new nation, as you're talking about, Evan. Or you can use your Vietnamese, your refugee experience to have greater empathy for other people who are refugees or other people who are outsiders. And when we look at the Vietnamese refugee community, unfortunately, we see a lot of the reactionary nationalist identity-based politics taking place, where Vietnamese refugees have said, and I'm quoting them, "We were the good refugees, these are the bad refugees," talking about Muslims, Arabs, brown people coming from south of the border, and so on. And I'm also teaching a class on the question of Palestine right now. We're reading Hannah Arendt, and in terms of what Hannah Arendt was saying about Jewish refugees in the 1940s, it's really compelling, challenging, and inspiring to remember that she was describing many of the same issues happening for Jewish refugees as well, that they face some of the same dilemmas. Are we going to privilege what she called the parvenu identity, where we want to assimilate and become part of the bourgeoisie, or do we want to be pariahs and stand as outsiders and affiliate with other outsiders? And that debate that she was illuminating back then foreshadows exactly what's happening today within the Jewish community, within the Israeli community as well, between those who are Zionists and those who are anti-Zionist as well. So those divisions exist, and as terrible as those conflicts may be, I also find inspiration. I think, Evan, you're gesturing at this, that there are people within these communities who have chosen the side of empathy, of recognizing that experience should point them towards affiliating with the outsiders, with the marginalized, with the oppressed, no matter what their identities happen to be. Now, I know, Cathy, you've been dealing with these kinds of issues yourself. I mean, how have you tried to confront these, or how have you been confronted by these issues within the Vietnamese diaspora?
It's an interesting question. I mean, like, I think of my parents, um, they are Trump Republicans. And also, as soon as my mother hears anything about war, she'll hear something about Ukraine, or if it's about Palestine, it will be just, I hate war. There's something about that human reaction to, but it's also, I also hate communism. So there's a lot of emotional weight to both sides. So I think what you're talking about is relevant to that, to her own identity, for instance, right? So that is really interesting to me, just sort of the possibilities of that generation. And I don't know, I can't speak for all Vietnamese Americans, of course not, but I do get the sense that um, a lot of young Asian diasporic people in general um, are, are feel very strongly in solidarity, especially artists, the artist community that I'm part of, feel very strongly in solidarity with Palestine. And I say Asian diasporic, I also mean Palestinians, but just non-Palestinian Asian diasporic people have a very strong sense um, that they have a real responsibility for Palestinians out there. So.
Now, we know that people who have spoken up for the Palestinian cause, whether they are Palestinians or not Palestinians, have often paid a significant price in one way or another for speaking up, and even using the word genocide, for example. Cathy, you were involved in this. I don't know. I hope you want to talk about it. You were and are now still the executive director of Kundiman, one of the premier Asian American arts organizations in the United States. And Kundiman, like many other arts organizations, found itself caught up in the post October 7th mess of contradictory emotions and politics, as there were tensions within Kundiman about the stance to take on Israel's genocide in Gaza, and you were directly caught up in all of this. Maybe you can tell us what happened and why you decided to take your stand.
Yeah, so I mean, it was very simple during, a few days after October 7th. And so, alongside many people, we put up a statement of support and solidarity with Palestine. And alongside spaces like the Asian American Writers Workshop, Kaya Press, which is a preeminent Asian Pacific American press, alongside MISNA, which is an arts organization for Sawana writers and artists. Um, and we received pushback from the board. And eventually I was fired as a result of many things. But that was the primary, it was something where I never had any trouble with the board. And that was the moment of rupture. And that moment of rupture is, I think, of as very significant and very interesting because we are a nonprofit organization, and nonprofits face a kind of pressure that maybe collectives don't face the same pressure. So there's a kind of way where maybe in the 60s or 70s, movements were really under, they were groups of activists who made collectives together. And the introduction of the nonprofit industrial complex has created a system of control by the government, by the US government, wherein nowadays, like the NEA is about to be dismantled. A lot of nonprofits for the arts are at risk of being dismantled. Or losing all of their funding. So there's a kind of way where it is almost inevitable that to speak politically as an arts organization may result in some sort of upheaval, right? Because it it goes against our government's wishes, like left or right, let's be honest, like there is a real strong desire for the US government to have Israel be a powerful space, and like ignore everything that it's supposed to stand for around human rights, which, I find very specious anyway. But yeah, essentially I got fired. And then, this was actually my first time learning what organizing looked like. And it was my Palestinian colleagues. It was also my Pacific Islander colleagues who have long been organizers, my trans colleagues, all of us together actually did amazing work, and we pushed out the board. I got rehired, So it is a story that is important to me because I didn't want there to be a nonprofit out there that, oh, you take a risk by speaking up. And that's all we did, speaking up for Palestine. And the result is that the person gets fired, and then that's the end of the story. I just couldn't let that narrative stand. So now I'm back. So that's the hope, right? That's the hope that that organizing did. And something that I learned from the experience is that the great poet and organizer Teresa Siagatonu during this process said, oftentimes people debate tactics, like what do you do? And Teresa's like, let's try everything. It's like throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks. And it in fact ended up being us doing that. We worked together and we just threw spaghetti at the wall, every single type of thing that we could do, coalesced in the possibility of, bringing on a new board that now aligns with the community's values, and especially in solidarity with Palestine, and all oppressed peoples, and bringing about the possibility of, like, any staff who got fired or had to quit, they have a space to return to if they want to.
Yeah. I think it is an inspiring story because obviously the roots of Asian American identity are radical roots from the late 1960s, fighting against the war, American war in Vietnam. And so, it's not simply that there's a Vietnamese and Palestinian solidarity as well, but there's also an Asian American solidarity with Palestine if we go back to the original radical roots of Asian American politics. But of course, what's happened in the last several decades is that a lot of Asian Americans are not very radical. And I think we do see a lot of complicity with certain kinds of Asian Americans in the American military industrial complex, and that extends to what the U.S. is doing in terms of supporting Israel as well. And so it was heartening to see that, in fact, while there is complicity, there's also a lot of resistance and a lot of adherence to these revolutionary ideals that formed Asian America in the first place. And Evyn, you're an academic. You're in Asian American Studies. The Association of Asian American Studies was, I think, the first organization to endorse BDS,
right.
Boycott, divestment sanctions. Tell us a little bit about that, about Asian American solidarity with Palestine, and how that has evolved up until the present. Because I think Asian American academics, if we just talk about them, some of them have been paying a price for standing up to speak with Palestine as well.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's right. So the Association of Asian American Studies, I think their statement came out in 2013. I'll have to double check for sure. It was one of the earliest kind of U.S. Associations that actually signed on to BDS, so the boycott, divestment, sanctions. In particular, from an academic standpoint, a boycott of Israeli universities as an institution. The idea being that, as knowledge producers, there's also a lot of weapons, research. So there's a direct tie, right, between universities and kind of military violence, which we see in the United States as well, right? Israel's no exception in this kind of regard. And this was followed by another association I'm associated with, the American Studies Association. More recently, they've been kind of in the public eye in their kind of public kind of critiques of American Studies associations of support of BDS and this kind of conversation, this national conversation now of like, what is America, right? What is American exceptionalism, and try to kind of hold on to that and debate, what that could mean. But our department at UCLA Asian American Studies also put out a solidarity statement with Palestine, actually in 2021, when again we had kind of a flare up with violence, but also kind of the movement that was happening in West Bank and Jerusalem, in Gaza as well, the kind of new uprising. And there we were really trying to think about, Palestine is central to Asian American studies. I mean, you've talked about this as well, Viet, but Palestine is part of West Asia, right? This kind of idea of the Middle East as separate from Southeast Asia and East Asia and South Asia is kind of a colonial construct. And so if we think about, Asia and kind of Asian American diaspora more expansively, then of course it has to include Palestine and Palestinian diaspora. And I have to say that, Palestinian identifying academics and scholars in particular are most heavily targeted. That was the case in our department. And so I think that the onus is on, folks like myself who see themselves standing in solidarity to really step up, right, and try to take on some of that labor. Because, at the end of the day, I'm not as big of a target, right? I haven't had people, send me like violent threats, et cetera, even though I'm part of this department and collectively signed onto the statement. So the stakes are different for me. And so given that privilege, I think that's something that we can, again, really activate in this movement for solidarity.
I think that's a really important point, and certainly one of the things I was hoping we would get to, which is what does meaningful solidarity look like? And there's no doubt that no matter what kind of price that some of us have paid who are not Palestinian, you're absolutely right that the greater price certainly is being paid by Palestinian people and their advocates. So it's kind of remarkable when someone who's not Palestinian loses their job, but that's a norm for what Palestinians have endured for so long, just speaking in that professional context. I have one last question for you before we take questions from our audience. And that is, we started this conversation talking about Vietnam, Palestine, and the history of revolution and the inspiration that they both drew from each other. And now we have a situation in which Vietnam is itself a nation state. Its revolution succeeded. Its revolution is now codified into the country and the nation of Vietnam itself. Quite a different reality than what Palestinians are looking at. So what lessons from post-war Vietnam, I would include the diasporas in that as well, but what lessons from post-war Vietnam might be relevant to imagining a just future in Palestine? Cathy, what do you think?
Evyn, you want to go first a little bit and then I'll go?
Okay, I guess I want to start by just sharing this story, which I think is relevant, and we'll get to this question. So one of the people that I interviewed for my book is Sadi Salama. He's the ambassador of the state of Palestine in Vietnam. He's been there for almost maybe more than a decade now. And so if we think about, not only the Vietnamese diaspora in Palestine or in the state of Israel, but also the Palestinian diaspora in Vietnam. It's very small, but, he can be counted as part of that. He's, started a family there, so he has Vietnamese Palestinian children. He's very invested on a personal level. But when I was asking him, what inspired you, A, to become an ambassador, but B, what is your connection, your long-term connection to Vietnam? And he was saying, growing up in the West Bank in a village outside of Hebron, he was selling newspapers, as a young child. And he remembers seeing on the front of the newspapers, US military tanks, rolling into Vietnam. And then in his own village, seeing Israeli military tanks, right, going into his village in Palestine and in the West Bank. And really just being struck by those visual parallels and therefore political parallels. And that kind of inspired this long, kind of lifelong turn to activism, right? And so I think, I learned a lot of lessons from him as someone who is actively navigating kind of post-revolutionary Vietnam politics. As we alluded to earlier, Vietnam has diplomatic relations with Israel. They support Israeli kind of military arms economy now. There's also a lot of kind of exchange around agriculture. And of course, agriculture is not a depolitical project. This kind of whole rhetoric of make the desert bloom is a very kind of terra nullius erasure of Palestinian life worlds that had been existed long before, right, the establishment of the State of Israel. And so I think he, as someone who's in this official ambassador, position, is trying to be very careful of recognizing, what is the Vietnamese state's position at the same time that he is really interested in reactivating this revolutionary history between Vietnam and Palestine and say, it doesn't have to be dead yet, right? Maybe it's not a part of official state policy yet, but he's always going to bring it into his conversations as a political figure. And I think just that kind of reminder, this kind of like, I'm really interested in like temporal echoes and how history repeats itself, but also how history can be an inspiration in the present, right? And so trying to reactivate that revolutionary potential, both in Vietnam, but also across the Vietnamese diaspora. And thinking about, how can that then inspire solidarity with Palestine and a kind of material support for the ongoing Palestinian liberation movement.
Cathy, what do you think?
It's interesting because as the question you pose, Viet, thinks about Vietnam, post-war Vietnam, and it also thinks about the diaspora. And I just find that there's such a big difference, I think, between what it means to live in Vietnam today. There is a lot of censorship. And so what artists, that's the space I know most about, artists and poets do, is they create these underground spaces where they are able to speak freely and to maintain a revolutionary sense of themselves and outside of whatever it is that the government would want them to think, believe, say, whatever it is. And I think that in the same but different way in the United States, we may have freedom of speech that is, eroding every day. But there is, I think, for me, I just think of the possibilities of language and speech and above ground, underground, in tunnels, in the spaces you can make it, and what speech can do. It can inspire, it can make you think, it can provide hope, it can make you see differently. So I think that for me, I look at poets during, so I'm thinking about June Jordan, We Are the Ones We've Been Waiting For. All of these possibilities of speech still feel like sites of power that people are feeling. I think people feel like they have no power. They're, something about social media, something about their lives lends themselves to feel powerless. And I think that what you were talking about, Evyn, before about, solidarity, a big part of it is to recognize our power, to cluster together, to speak up even when you're at risk. And that risk, you have to understand, is less of a risk when you have people with you and you stand with others. So I think that is probably the lesson I would say that I took with me and continue to take with me.
You've been listening to Accented Dialogues in Diaspora with our guests, Evyn Lê Espiritu Gandhi and Cathy Linh on the topic of Vietnam and Palestine. We have some questions from the audience, and the first question is very short, but maybe challenging question. It's from Emily Lay, I believe, and she asks, "What's the difference between anti-colonialism and decolonialism?" Evan, you're the academic. Maybe you can give us a really short answer of the difference between those two things.
Yeah, I think the anti-colonial is really just an antagonism between the colonial power and the anti-colonial movement. And the anti-colonial movement wants to replace the colonial power, but not necessarily a critique of the structures of like nation building or statecraft that made that colonial power have power in the first place, right? There's this idea like, I want to gain the power. It doesn't matter how problematic the power is, right? So I think the decolonial is actually trying to unpack and critique those power formations and to think about less hierarchical ways of collective living. And so, on kind of one material level, this looks like a critique of settler colonialism and indigenous displacement and say, okay, how can we think about a collectivity, for example, here in the United States, that's not built upon centuries of kind of ongoing indigenous and native displacement. What does it mean to think about refugee indigenous solidarities and connections in a decolonial frame?
I think the question of decolonization comes up in a couple of questions that we have, and here's one from Kang Din. How do diasporic Vietnamese negotiate the dissonance between cultural touchstones of the diaspora? For example, Paris by night. The sentiments, political views that these touchstones might have and which they continue to uphold. How do we negotiate the dissonance between that with the perspective of shared struggle between Vietnam and Palestine? This seems to me like a question about decolonization. Like how do we celebrate and uphold sort of our colonial legacies in some way with what's a decolonizing position when we identify Vietnam and Palestine? And this is especially with people immigrating from Vietnam in the last decade. How does the Vietnamese diaspora preserve and evolve its culture in a way that embraces the changing demographic of the Vietnamese diaspora? Cathy, what do you think?
It's an interesting question. Thank you for asking it, and I think I'm gonna probably answer it partially, but going back to what Evan was talking about, it feels like a yes and, right? You can be a refugee who, loves Paris by night, and has that as a cultural touchstone, and also politically, that can be a nostalgia, that can be, Paris by Night is so many things, I have to say, Um, for those who don't know, it's this, I don't know, how to call it. It's like a performance, where people are lip syncing many songs, and it's such a part of Vietnamese identity and connection and music and dance and it's also Paris, like our dear colonizers. So but I mean, I think it's all of that. Like, are you any more revolutionary if you just reject banh mi because it's like, we didn't have bread? Like I'm just saying that all of these things are part of our history, and there's a way to think about it as part of us, and that our political commitments can also include moving toward always clarifying who we care for and what we care about. Evan, do you have something, or should we move on?
Well, the next one's for Evan
That's a
anyway.
great
But
answer.
I think the next one is also a decolonizing question as well. It's from Dr. Rabab Abduhadi, who, by the way, I thank you for correcting me that it's apparently not Rasan Kanafani who designed the Vietnam-Palestine Solidarity poster, but it is Ismail Shamut from 1972. So Dr. Rabab Abduhadi asks, can you please discuss the connection between the assimilationist impulse into Americanness among Asian American communities and Asian American studies, and the impact of this assimilationist impulse on positions vis-a-vis U.S. policies and solidarities, such as the incarceration of Japanese people in World War II, the Vietnam War, Cuba, Palestine, invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, and who is Asian and who's not. Evan, that's your question.
Sorry. Thank you for the question. Yeah, I'm not sure I fully understand the question, but I think that, there's this what you're speaking to is this larger question of like who does Asian American studies represent, right? And who is the Asian American that Asian American studies invokes? And I think that one um, kind of surface critique is that Asian American studies is only interested in kind of leftist activism, right? So if we think about the beginning of the Asian American movement, which was inspired by the Black Radical movement, by AIM, the American Indian movement, the Chicano, kind of nationalist movement, they were really mobilized by critiques of the Vietnam War. But then you have all these anti-communist Vietnamese refugees who were not on the side of the communist revolution who come to the United States, and then Asian American studies has to contend, right, with this unruly figures, right, these seemingly conservative reactionary figures. And so I think that the challenge of the field is to both take seriously, what are some of the pressures that really push, Asian and Asian American immigrants to have this assimilationist impulse, right? I don't think it comes from nowhere. And so for me, it's really about shifting away from, I guess, like blaming individuals or unpacking the politics of individuals per se, and rather to, understanding community self-expressions is really important. But the other side of that framework is to kind of understand, okay, what are the larger, as you mentioned, policy, US foreign policy structures that move people and displace them in the first place, right? So kind of moving to, critiques of US empire in Vietnam, and, also thinking about US, it sounds like US is going to try to potentially intervene in Cuba, kind of the decades-long pressure on the Cuban government as another kind of communist stronghold. And so trying to think about, how can we really understand where these assimilations impulses come from, but also like push forward towards, I guess, yeah, more decolonial horizons.
Yeah. So this kind of decolonial work in the academy or in the world of art, and just anywhere in the world of culture within the United States is under a lot of political and economic pressure. As Cathy already gestured to earlier, the federal government has its ability to shape so many different things because of federal money in the universities, in the world of art, and so on. So we have a couple of questions that are related to this issue. I believe of what it means to sort of think critically and the pressures that are leveled against that. Jacqueline Rush Rivera says a headline today from where I am in Texas is the UT system, University of Texas system, has voted to limit quote unquote controversial topics in class as the state moves to exert more control over what is taught by professors. Florida, Ohio, other states are also going in this direction. Are there any suggestions that any of you would like to share on how to navigate this authoritarian moment? And I think Oliver Thomas has a related question. He asks, do you have any advice for graduate students wanting to write and research about Palestine in the academy, particularly in these times? I think these are related issues. There's all kinds of political pressures on the academy. Professors are facing the brunt of this, but so are very vulnerable graduate students working on Palestine, but also on any other kind of topic that's designated as controversial. But I don't think there's any doubt that all these topics are sort of intertwined together. Either of you want to take a
Yeah, I
answer
would
this?
say Pal Legal is a great resource. So, Lawyer Up, I think that's a big, like, that is actually deeply helpful. That was part of our strategy for winning, finding legal support because actually once you're able to talk to a lawyer, and have a lawyer on your side or give you legal advice, you are able to take greater risks because you actually know that a lot of these moments of repression, well, first of all, unfortunately, money talks, and the truth is, a lawsuit is extremely expensive. So the system might not even, if they know that you are going to fight legally, the amount of money they have to pour into their own legal battle over something that is basically fundamentally, about freedom of speech, can be deterred by people just knowing, being put on notice that you have a lawyer on your side that actually gives you advice. And a lot of these, Pal Legal has toolkits, and they also have a lot of cases where they know what is and what happened. Everything's changing all the time, but actually, a lot of times when we're looking at the government stealing money from universities, you'll see that a lot of this money has been returned because it's not legal to take it to steal and pillage in this particular way. So I think that the more that we can stand up, and it's like it is a risk, like to stand up and try to do something, because you might lose your job, but you also might not. And in fact, you might get a settlement out of it. So that's my advice.
Evan, what about the question about what graduate students, or I assume this will also extend to, junior professors, but really anybody vulnerable in the academy who wants to write about Palestine?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. It's really complicated. It's really scary right now. The kind of erosion of freedom of speech, academic freedoms, as Cathy was mentioning, and the like very strong repression that's happening. At the same time, I think that in circles of the academy, there are a lot of support for this kind of scholarship, right? And so I want to acknowledge that there are really real risks involved, right? Like Cathy said, you could lose your job, and it might become a moment of like having to find a new graduate program, or being passed over for a particular job. But if this is your life's work and you really believe in it, then you just have to speak truth to power and hope that the opportunity, kind of opens up. But I think that everybody has to kind of make that risk assessment for themselves. And I think that there's no judgment. Some people, like I said, hold the burden of risk and vulnerability more than others. And so it's kind of also assessing one's like point of privilege. What I can say as a Vietnamese Filipina, American is different than what some, Palestinian colleagues can say, even though a lot of the times, of course, they're on the front lines, right, and are carrying the brunt of the vulnerability. So I guess I would just say, reach out. There are, mentors and guidance figures and supporters out there. So it's really just building that collectivity and that network, as Cathy was mentioning too. Who's your support system?
We have a couple of really interesting questions on this new Board of Peace that Donald Trump has created and its relationship to our topic. From Jamie Veve, how do we address the immediate agreement of Vietnam joining the so-called Board of Peace, dominated by mostly authoritarian Arab and non-Arab regimes, while ironically most of genocide complicit Europe has declined, including governments from the South like Mexico under extreme political Mexico's under extreme political and economic pressure. Dien Zong Ha from Stanford has a related issue. She asks, how should we interpret what seems like a conflicting signal from post-war Vietnam today, specifically with the General Secretary Do Lum's participation in the Board of Peace's inaugural meeting in D.C. today? What might this suggest about how Vietnam is positioning its revolutionary legacy in the present? These are really interesting questions, and it goes back to that issue that we talked about earlier, like Vietnam supports Palestine, but it's also obviously trying to have good relationships with Israel, which apparently means trying to have a good relationship with Donald Trump in the present as well. And I'm just assuming that all of this is also wrapped up with Vietnam, its geopolitical situation relative to China. Do either of you want to take on this topic?
Well, I'll just start by saying that what I find really interesting is that the political figure that unites both, Vietnam and the Vietnamese Communist Party and the very staunchly anti-communist Vietnamese diaspora is Donald Trump. They both love him, unfortunately. And so, yes, like you said, a lot of it has to do with the critique of China, kind of long-standing Vietnamese critiques of Chinese imperialism in Vietnam. And so Trump's kind of tough on China stance, Vietnam stands to benefit. I think this is also just kind of a product of our neoliberal present, right? And it's really interesting to see how the Vietnamese communist state to stay in power and to gain more kind of economic prowess, I guess, or economic benefits for at least some segments of its, Vietnamese population, is really trying to navigate these changing global forces. And if they can step into, kind of a global power spotlight, such as on the Board of Peace, which is super problematic, is that a way that they can retain legitimacy, right, with their citizenry? I think it gets really complicated because they're trying to do the both and, while also, harking back to kind of Vietnam's revolutionary past as a form of governmental legitimacy. So I think it's really complicated and also depressing. But, I think a lot of scholars have written about this kind of post-colonial failure of the revolutionary promises, right? That all of these things that Ho Chi Minh, for example, promised, and that so many activists around the world were inspired by, once that kind of governing power gets into positions of statecraft, what kind of pragmatic and neoliberal decisions do they make that actually go against a lot of that revolutionary rhetoric?
I mean, theoretically, people who are signing up for this board of peace are thinking, "Oh, two-state solution," even though obviously that's not going to happen. So I mean, I could see some kind of rhetorical, wrangling on the part of the Vietnamese state, thinking, "Well, we can join the Board of Peace and still endorse the two-state solution," even though I think the Board of Peace is actively designed not to actually make that happen. If you think that's the goal you want, Cathy, did you have anything to add? Okay, here's the last question from an anonymous attendee. Where can I start to learn about the connection between Southeast Asia and the Middle East? The anonymous attendee is a young person living in Vietnam who wants to learn about and challenge the mindset that created the divide between Southeast Asia and the Middle East in the first place.
That's a good question. I guess I'll just start by, to read my book. I do a lot of this tracing about, kind of both on an academic level with kind of the division of knowledge into area studies, the so-called Middle East and kind of American university studies, quote unquote, of the Middle East were separated and siloed from studies of Southeast Asia. And a lot of these area studies departments kind of got their start during the kind of Cold War and earlier, when the US was like, the reason they wanted to study these places is because, they wanted to invade them or enfold them into the kind of global capitalist regime. And so how can we, I guess, decolonize those legacies, right? You have to actively push against the way that our communities have been siloed against one another. So yeah, I think that Viet has written a lot about this too, just thinking about, some of these connections between Southeast Asia and West Asia.
Yeah, I put in Rasan Kanafani's book, Selected Political Writings, which has the essay on the inspirational power of the Vietnamese Revolution for the Palestinians. If you go back and you start to look at the sort of the cultural discourse of that time, in the newspapers and the revolutionary periodicals, and sort of like the propaganda that was being produced on the part of the revolutionaries, you see those connections pretty clearly. That for the Vietnamese people, they wanted international solidarity. I visited, for example, the War Remnants Museum in Ho Chi Minh City or Saigon, and there's a whole, I don't know if it still exists, but there was a whole wing devoted to international solidarity. So the Vietnamese Revolution was intent on showing that there was all kinds of connections between what was happening in Vietnam and what was happening globally, and all these decolonizing movements, whether they were in Algeria or in Palestine or in El Salvador or in Cuba, they were making those kinds of connections as well. So it's really been sort of an intent to erase these kinds of international revolutionary linkages that a country like the United States has been active in doing. Also, read Edward Said's Orientalism. Just read the beginning and read the end, the introduction and the afterword. But Said is making an incredibly influential argument about Orientalism and the Orient and how the West sees the East. People kind of tend to forget that he's really talking about what what you called the anonymous attendee, the Middle East or the Near East, and what Evyn and others are now calling West Asia and Southwest Asia. And so when he talks about the Oriental, he's not only talking about East and Southeast Asians. He's talking about Palestinians. He's talking about Egyptians and so on. And in the afterword to Orientalism, he makes it very clear. He says, in the afterword to Orientalism, he actually addresses the Vietnam War, and he makes connections between how the United States has represented Orientals, as in the Vietnamese people, in these really racist ways, and with the way that the United States has been representing Muslims and Arabs perpetually. And so once you start to see that Muslims and Arabs are Orientals, just like Vietnamese people are Orientals in the Western imagination, particularly, the French, the English, and the Americans, the connections become pretty obvious. And if we think in terms of identities, like, oh, the Vietnamese people look one way and therefore they're not like the Palestinians who look another way, that's colonialism dividing and conquering, when in fact in the colonial Orientalist imagination that Edward Said lays out in Orientalism, he breaks it down. These are all different variations of the same pattern of Orientalist domination. Cathy, last word to you.
I just dropped into the chat a great anthology of Palestinian poetry, Heaven Looks Like Us. There's just so many interesting poets and writers in the Palestinian diaspora and Palestinian poets in general, or writers in general, that I think are doing amazing work. So I would say that's another place to find rooted in Palestinian life and thinking during this moment of genocide. So I think that that is a wonderful place to be as well.
Yeah. And once we start thinking about these questions of connections, you start seeing connections all over the place that you've never seen before. And it's just really mind blowing. I'll just leave with a postscript from my own research. If you've seen the movie Rambo Part 2 is set in Vietnam. Rambo Part 3 is set in Afghanistan. So Rambo goes off after he's fought the Vietnamese communists. Now he's going to go to Afghanistan and he's going to fight the Soviet communists in the name of the Afghan people. The movie is dedicated to the Mujahideen of Afghanistan fighting against the Soviets. And do you know where they shot Rambo Part 3? In Israel, in the deserts of Israel, where Israelis played the Afghan people. So colonialism and imperialism are global systems. The people who run these systems certainly think of them in that way. That's why we have the Board of Peace. That's why Hollywood could make Rambo fight first in Vietnam and then take him into Afghanistan and shoot these movies in the Philippines and in Israel. It is a global network. The connections exist. You do have to do a little bit of work because the system doesn't want you to make these connections. I'm so thankful to our two guests, Evyn Lê Espiritu Gandhi and Cathy Linh, for helping us make some of these connections. As it comes to the question of Vietnam and Palestine. Thanks to all of you. You've been listening to Accented Dialogues in Diaspora on the question of Vietnam and Palestine. See you soon.